Hello and welcome to Latika Takes, a podcast with me, Latika Berg. Hello, welcome back to the podcast. This is an episode I've been holding over for a couple of weeks, not intentionally, just a lot of things got in the way between the time I recorded this interview. So you will notice a couple of timestamps during this chat. One is, for instance, Donald Trump hadn't yet carried out his strikes on Iran, and the NATO conference, which I attended, partly why there's been a bit of a delay in bringing you this episode, that also hadn't taken place. But we did know what the outcome of that would be and all went ahead. So it's still relevant to this chat. So who's my guest? It's Richard Spencer. I'm so thrilled he joined me because he's doing a hell of a lot of work on AUKUS through his position at Bondi Partners, which is a private firm set up by Joe Hockey, who is Australia's former treasurer and also a former ambassador to the US, and he served under Trump 1.0, as did Richard Spencer. He was the United States Secretary of the Navy between 2017 and 2019, and like so many figures who served during Trump 1.0, left over a row, which you can go and look up. It's inconsequential to the purposes of our conversation, although we do semi-address it a bit later on when he talks about working in the DoD and public service under Trump. And we also have a bit of a discussion about Trump and his objectives and his foreign policy goals and whether he's achieving them with his style necessarily. Now, Richard Spencer has a very broad and quite an interesting career. He was a Marine. He's also a private sector guy. So he brings a whole range of skills to the job that he's doing now, which also includes chairman of Austal, a shipbuilding company that operates in the United States, in Asia and Australia. So really, there is no better guest to talk about the snap review commissioned by the Pentagon's Elbridge Colby into AUKUS, why it has been commissioned, what it can mean, what I guess we should be reading in the tea leaves, and also bringing in the broader debate about where AUKUS is at, what it needs, and the Australian government's stewardship of AUKUS, I guess, is the best word. This is a really great discussion, not going to lie. It's a very AUKUS discussion, but I still think you'll enjoy it even if you're only loosely interested in AUKUS. If you're dedicated to this subject, you're going to love it. Let's get into it. Richard Spencer, welcome to the podcast.
It's great to be here.
Could you start by telling me whether you think the prospect of a conflict with China or in the Indo-Pacific is now closer than at the time when you ceased being Secretary of the Navy?
That's an interesting question. And there's no binary answer, Latika, but let me phrase it this way. Obviously, the tensions are higher. There's more metal on the ocean, under the ocean, and in the air. And my biggest worry, to be very frank with you, is not an intentional action by China, but an accident, quote unquote. You've seen some of the aggressive actions in the air with the flares being set off in front of a Canadian P-8. There'll be a safety issue and it'll cause harm, and that might trigger something. I'm more worried about that than I am a political action right off the bat.
Well, traditionally, that is actually how conflicts start too, isn't it?
Yes. And, back when John Lehman was Secretary of the Navy, they did that great effort where they had communications with the Russian Navy during the Cold War, and it was specifically for safety reasons. It was not a political connection. It was, we are operating here, we are doing this, and we're training, and there was an interchange so there would not be unintentional crossings of swords.
So this is why when China cut off communications, as it did with Australia during COVID, and it did with the Biden administration after the balloon incident, that was such a dangerous time in our history.
Exactly. That worries me more than the geopolitical issues, the unintended consequences of no communications.
Are we ready?
We're ready as we'll ever be. I have no doubts that if, in fact, the United States Navy and our allies are called to engage, we will engage. I'm a firm believer, just to give you my background, I'm a firm believer the reason you have a very, very strong Department of Defense or Ministry of Defense, depending upon what country you are, is to give your State Department one more day to negotiate. You don't lead with the DOD. The DOD is a lever that's used.
Mm. And has the nature of how that conflict might take shape, should it, has that evolved in any way, you think?
Well, we war game it religiously, as do our allies, and then we war game it also with our allies. It's problematic. I'm not speaking anything out of school. There's no confidentiality here, but look at it. It's an away game for everybody, and it's a home game for China.
Mm.
So you have a whole logistics chain issue. You have just the logistics of putting things in the air and on the water on an away game that increase the risk profile dramatically.
How essential are allies to the United States?
Well, you're speaking to someone who's not only a globalist, but one of the, let me back up.
Globalist is a dirty word these days, Richard.
I
I'm
know.
surprised to see you confess to this.
Now you see why I'm not in this administration.
We'll get to that, don't worry.
I am a firm believer in alliesism. When Jim Mattis asked me to become his Secretary of the Navy, which is actually how the message came in, I'm the accidental secretary, not the original first choice. I knew Jim and really appreciate the way he thinks, but one of the primary way he thinks is he had a great statement. He said, we have to nurture this amazing constellation of allies and friends that we have. And that just sung true to me. And he did a very interesting thing with his service secretaries. Heather Wilson was Air Force, Mark Esper was Army, and I was Navy. And he divided up the portfolio of countries geographically and by theater for each service secretary to focus on. So I had the Indo-Pacific, and interesting enough, I had Norway because there are a lot of Marines in Norway. But you got to actually be his proxy to a lesser degree and a greater degree, depending upon certain issues. And it really allowed you to understand alliedism and how we are viewed and how we project ourselves and how we can work side by side. I had a great story where Secretary Mattis called my office. He had the whole Vietnamese Defense Ministry team in town, Army, Air Force, Navy, and Minister of Defense. And the message I got was, he says, I'm tied up at the White House. Could you take your Navy barge, the Secretary's barge, which is a boat, and take them out to dinner on the Potomac, which is a standard fare? I said, certainly. And the whole team arrived. I had my translator. The Minister of Defense was the senior person. His officers are with him. And we're speaking via translator. And the message from the DOD was, we view you as friends, allies. We stand beside you. We do not land with two big boots and charge out in front of you. We look to our side with you and go, what do we do here? We share information because this is your country. You know it. You know best. We are here to support and walk alongside you. And his interpreter was pulled close to the minister, and the minister is talking quite with energy. And her face turns red, and she said, Mr. Secretary, could you repeat that? And I repeated it again, and the minister turned around and said, those are very interesting words. Now let's talk. And everyone spoke English.
They knew the whole time.
Yeah.
How fascinating.
But I mean, and the bond that we formed with Vietnam during that 3-year period was stunning, fascinating.
Is Donald Trump putting that at risk?
Yeah, I think he is. I understand the concept of make America great again, but you can't do it alone in today's complex world. You can make America great again and work right alongside your allies. I look at Australia, where I have a tremendous focus, obviously, not only with Bondi Partners, but as the chair of Austal Limited, the Australian shipbuilder, which happens to be the third largest shipbuilder in the United States for the United States Navy and Coast Guard. I love Australia. They are our best ally when it comes to time and place. They've been with us 1918 onwards in every single conflict alongside us, no questions asked. The treasure that they have put alongside the U.S. above and beyond dollars and trade surplus is stunning. On a per capita basis, it's greater than our loss and treasure. And obviously, when I'm saying loss and treasure, I mean our men and women. You can do business together, but you do not have to kick people in the teeth while you do business.
Where do you think that has happened?
Well, let's look at Australia. I mean, I will question why there's even a tariff. Yes, we have the issue with beef, but you know what? Let's sit down and talk about beef. Maybe we do need to have to be able to track our cows from birth through the whole path. We have technology. We can do that.
Yeah.
These are not hurdles that can't be hurdled. We just have to sit down and talk. We can't sit there and lob a stone through the window and say, now let's be friends.
Do you think the review into AUKUS and whether or not it should be scrapped, is that kicking in the teeth?
Yeah, so on Friday, I was spending quite a bit of time with Australian media because of the announcement that Bridge Colby was doing the review. Well, let me first say, worked with Bridge in Trump 1. I have great respect for Bridge. He has the intelligence, the acumen to look at complex problems. But look, this was laid down in the Biden administration. And I'll also say I think it's some of the best statecraftery that's done in the last 70 years. I think AUKUS is a beautiful thing in many fronts, Pillar 1, Pillar 2. But now it's the Trump administration. They have the right to review it. And I think that's actually healthy because when you review something, things have changed in 3 years. You poke something, you get stronger, you can amend things. At the core of it will remain the same. Maybe things change on the periphery. I do not think this is a scrap exercise. My comment to people in Australia, the press was kind of going high and right. I said, be calm and breathe through your nose. This is what I would consider a regular process that's in due course.
Look, I want to agree with you, but there's two things here. We know Bridge Colby is on the record. In fact, I myself asked Bridge Colby about this. He does not agree with the notion of AUKUS, and it's not just from a production rate issue. He has questioned why the US would give the crown jewels of nuclear propelled technology to another country, even if it's Australia. There is also a question about whether Australia would be in any fight. And now, of course, then we come to the production issue, which is the window of threat in the Indo-Pacific is now very narrow and the US might need its boats itself. So there's that issue. Secondly, the premise of this very review is about whether it should be scrapped. When the UK did its review, it was about how to unblock the blockages to progress and accelerate AUKUS because there are problems with it. So isn't the premise and the very idea that it's Bridge Colby conducting this review show that it is actually in more peril or in danger than you're letting on?
No, I actually disagree with that premise. His statement before he started was he wanted to make sure it checks the box. This is also the Secretary of Defense stated this. It checks the box of what the president wants to do. Does it fit into Make America Great Again? Does it fit into the president's primary structure? The biggest block in my readings from Bridge is the production.
Yeah.
I mean, when I was secretary, we were at about 2. At that point, we were at 2 a year. We slumped down, I think, at COVID down to 1.3, 1.2. We're up to 1.6 now. Look, Austal, a lot of people don't know this. The Australian shipbuilder that happens to be in Mobile, Alabama, 87% of our revenues come from the United States Department of Defense and Coast Guard. We are making the command module for the Virginia-class submarine in Mobile, Alabama. That's exactly what Electric Boat should be doing. Spreading the risk out to other manufacturers on a modular basis to get back up on plane for 2. That is the primary concern.
How soon can the US Navy get back to 2?
I'll go out on a limb. I think we can do it sooner rather than later. I would think if, in fact, we can see module production increasing, I think we can get back to 2 within 12 months.
Okay, so that does put AUKUS back into a viability prospect.
We can do whatever we put our mind to. This is this whole leadership issue. I've been over here for 3 days, a meeting in Parliament talking solely AUKUS.
Yep.
And all 3 partners, the biggest word I have is urgency. There's some great talking going on, but we have to start seeing dirt moving. We have to start, the money is flowing, but we have to start really seeing some leverage of physicality being applied to the AUKUS model.
Can I ask a really basic question? What is actually the slowdown in producing these submarines? Obviously, they're extremely technical and they're difficult and they're going to take X amount of time. But when they slow down to this rate, is it a manpower? Is it physical equipment? Is it that we don't have people or enough who can wire the things up? What is it actually that slows it down so much?
All of the above.
Right.
So what we had, if you look at Electric Boat and Newport News for that matter, there was quite a big contingency that came into retirement zone over the last 3 years that retired out. Both organizations did what they could to retain what they could. But when someone walks out the door having worked on a Virginia for 15 years, there's a little book, whether it be physically in his pocket or her pocket or in his head, the institutional knowledge on how to do Section 4 of Module 3, all the little secrets of how you do it effectively and efficiently. The learning curve walks out the door. Now, the new person who's been tutelage or journeyman under that person gets to step up now, but doesn't have the same knowledge. That's on the human resource side, so that slows it down.
Yep.
COVID hits. The supply chain did go pear-shaped, and it's still recovering, but it's not in bad shape. There are certain pockets that are, but in whole, it's getting better. So it's a confluence of those 2 elements. on a platform that is very, very complex.
So, given what you've said and your confidence about getting back up to a production rate of 2, do you think Australia needs a backup plan to AUKUS?
I've been thinking about that the whole time because we've got to push that around in my parliamentary meetings. At this point, I really don't think they do. Now, I say that with some reservation because I'm a firm believer that you should always have plan B and plan C. I would still give it, if we can't get on plane in 12 months, I'd start developing an alternative plan. That's the way I'd look at it. I still think the U.S. can get there on the production level that'll solve the problem.
What would an alternative plan look like?
That's why I'm pausing. I really don't know right now. I mean, you had the French option in there. Don't know if that could be brought alive again. I'm sure it could with the right amount of resources. There are options out there.
It's a bit worrying. Do you think that the Colby Review is an attempt to get the Australian government to lift its defence spending? It's currently projected to reach 2.3% of GDP by the early 2030s. We're looking at a NATO summit in The Hague where allies are looking to commit 3.5% in real defence spending and another 1.5% on associated defence spending. Australia starts to look extremely meagre by that index. Is this something Australia needs to address if it wants to secure AUKUS?
Yeah. I'll step back to 2017 when we first started really pushing NATO on 3%. And I always was asking, where's the data? I'm kind of a data-centric guy. Where's the data to support 3%? And it really was just a stick the finger in the air and looked at everyone's numbers and said, that kind of averages out. If we get people up to 3, it would be better. It wasn't the ultimate answer. It was a great number. 3 seems to have stuck, and everybody needs to come to 3. The reason I'm approaching it like that, I think a better approach would be, can you do the mission you're tasked to do? That's the most important thing. That being said, Australia should step up a little more on the budget if they're serious about performing in the alliance that we have over in the Indo-Pacific and completing their mission.
Was this a factor within the administration? Because we hear a lot of complaints from the US about Europe. We don't really hear them so much about the Indo-Pacific. In fact, Rich Colby's about the only one who's been willing to voice any sorts of criticisms about this. Mm-hmm. Was it a live current of thought? And is it valid?
Yes, it is valid. And I approach that answer in the fact that to be 100% across the board for all missions, they do not have the appropriate funding right now. I would also say to do every single mission, I don't know if the United States is funded appropriately. To be very frank, you do 100% of absolutely everything. That is a big task with a big bill to it. To be able to do the missions for the risk profile in your theater, a different level of resource and funding. That's where I think people are focusing. I think that's where Bridge is focusing, and he's right in the Indo-Pacific. We do need to get more resources allocated, but more importantly, or equally as important, and this is one thing we talked about yesterday with both our British friends, the U.S. included, and Australia, we have to get the urgency flag up. There has to be a drumbeat. There has to be the statement, tomorrow, not next week. When it comes to policy, when it comes to acquisition, when it comes to the physicality of training, it has to have urgency to it. And that's lacking right now.
Who needs to drive that?
I think it has to be the collective 3 buy into it.
I visited HMAS Stirling last year. Now, they've done a lot of work since I was there, but I was actually truly shocked by what is essentially a very country, sleepy little Australian town. It's lovely. It's beautiful. It sits right next to a kind of recreational fishing camp kind of thing.
You call it camouflage.
Look, it's a very nice spot. I imagine in the 80s it was beautiful, but it does not seem to me fit for purpose for what we need to rotate US submarines out of that base. Is it fit for purpose in your view?
No, it's not. And I think a lot of decisions have to be made in Australia, and I am on the outside looking in, but I would think Perth, Fremantle, that's where we were launching submarines in World War II. We had all nations in there that had undersea vessels. Let's use that geographically, consolidate the Henderson district. They've talked about it. The Australians have talked about it. I'm sure in their hearts there's a plan, but you know what? That should be started yesterday. We need to start moving dirt. We need consolidation to be laid out, then start moving dirt, doing the consolidation, putting the infrastructure in, because 2027 is going to be here in a blink of an eye, and 2030 will follow very quickly.
Do you think this is the perception that is driving some of these views
Yes,
inside the Trump
I do.
administration?
Yes.
So to summarize, it sounds like you're saying there's an anxiety or a concern that the Australian government's heart is not so much in AUKUS or in driving it forward as well as it should be.
I'm going to rephrase that, Latika. I think their heart's there. We need to see action. I think there's those that are driving AUKUS in Australia truly believe it, but there has to be more action. It has to go from politics to military to construction.
Mm.
It can't just continually be a policy. There has to be an output metric.
So in the UK, Stephen Lovegrove has been appointed as a specific envoy. He conducted the UK's review. And then out of that, he gets a nice job. Now, I'm also wondering if maybe somebody should commission a review in Australia and get a nice job, but we actually probably don't even need the review. Should we have dedicated envoys for AUKUS?
Most definitely. Most definitely. I sat with Stephen the other day and we exchanged some ideas and beliefs, and we're all aligned. I'm wildly happy that he's doing what he's doing in the position he's doing. We should have that on the U.S. side on a dedicated basis. Again, this supporting the drumbeat I'm talking about. And we should have a plug-in play in Australia where these people plug in and give them some wide latitude, and the Australians wide latitude with us also to go, if we need more resources or if we need more training, it's available from the other two partners at any one time. That was the whole purpose of AUKUS.
Yes, exactly. Okay, does the US need to hear out loud a commitment from Australia that we would be involved, or if we had these boats, they would be deployable for any conflict over Taiwan or in the Indo-Pacific if it comes to it?
So when AUKUS was brought together, that was one of the fears the Keatings had, et cetera, was all of a sudden would be drawn into a war. And the submarines come with a tag that says you have to, this will automatically follow a U.S. Virginia-class submarine. I'm a firm believer that they're our ally. I'm a firm believer they have their own sovereign rights. Mm. We are allies in conflicts. We've proven that we can do this. And if, in fact, it's a conflict that involves us, I would think that Australia would be there. I don't want to mandate it.
Yeah.
I do not want to mandate it. That is not my concept of alliedism. They will come on their own regard and belief.
Yes, I actually agree. And I think mandating it would be the worst possible outcome for the bilateral relationship.
Could not
actually.
agree more.
Yeah. If worst case scenario is that we don't get these Virginia-class boats, either Bridge Colby has a look at the data and says, nope, not going to Australia, sorry, or the production rate doesn't get back up to that drumbeat as you hope it will in 12 months' time, is the worst case scenario that you, the Americans, based out of HMAS Sterling in WA, and you control the theatre of conflict from that base. And we essentially, in that scenario, become an outpost for your military.
Yeah. I mean, let's take the model back a little differently. One of the big things that when I was secretary that was hobbling the undersea service was maintenance. They were lined up like a car wash out in front of the yards waiting to go into maintenance. That has to be fixed. We're working on that now, but that alleviates the two-number production right there. Or not alleviates it, it helps it. Yeah. We can get more vessels out to sea, but then Latika, we have to man those vessels, okay? That is where the beginning of Pillar 1 begins. We now have Australian crews in Virginia throughout the whole submarine. We used to have them on board, but there are places they couldn't go.
Right.
Now there is full access up and down the ship. I mean, I see an alternative even to owning it, that the Australians will be a crewed ship on our Virginias. We're going to need that. That's an integral resource that we need.
What about the nuclear weapon aspect, though?
Well, there's a command and control system to manage that.
Mm-hmm. You think
a very well-processed, well-policed command and control system.
Let's talk about nuclear weapons. Can we talk a little bit about, there was a change, I think, under Bush about the types of nuclear weapons your submarines carry. Now they carry much larger nuclear weapons, and there was a time where they used to carry tactical nuclear weapons. Do you think that needs to be put back in the mix?
I think the policy reviews that have gone on so far have addressed the threat and have come to an algorithm that makes the balance appropriate for what's loaded now. And while that sounds like word salad, I truly mean what I just said.
Which means what, though?
The makeup that we have now addresses the threat.
It's good enough.
Yes.
Okay. So you don't need to overcomplicate the deterrence mix that you have
I
at
believe we
your
do not.
availability. Do you think we are headed for conflicts with China?
Intentionally, no. I am a believer in peace through power. I mean, again, as I said earlier, you have to have a hammer behind the negotiator to make sure that they know that you're serious about what you're negotiating. Where is Xi on this? I mean, China is not in its strongest footing right now, even though materiel-wise, they have a lot of ships. The economy is not doing that well. He wants to be emperor for life and be known for what he's doing. And he has a timeline that he's already adjusted it once. He's going to, I think, only move when he feels completely comfortable. As we start getting up on our footing, that changes his calculus on a continuous basis also. So, if you're asking me, will there be a conflict at any time in the next 30 years, I'd probably say something might happen. I don't think it's going to happen in the immediate future, unless for some reason he sees a window where he can just strike quickly. We happen to be doing something else. I'll just put it that way. I don't know what that is, but if he interprets it as a window.
What if that window is a merged threat environment or a merged theater environment? So we have a war in Europe that President Trump said he would stop within 24 hours of becoming president. Hey, presto, it's not stopped, and it's unlikely to stop. We have the potential of a major escalation between Iran and Israel. And suddenly you see the deployment of US forces that way. You see Donald Trump rushing home from a G7 to deal with this conflict. All of a sudden, the Indo-Pacific, maybe this window becomes freer for Xi because the United States is extremely overstretched. Europe is certainly not ready. It can't even defeat Russia on its own as is. And countries like Australia are still talking about how to make AUKUS work as opposed to getting it going.
This data has been put into the gaming model. You have people like Sam Paparo over there as heading up Indo-Pacific. He has a full-throated voice when it comes to the table. Policymakers on the defense side have to put this into the calculation when they're giving the president advice. And that would be a very high-risk situation at that point. Would Xi take advantage of that? I mean, the wargaming models are not pretty at all for either side. For us, it's an away game. It's probably a little more damaging on our side of the equation, but you bring up all the aspects that have to be considered at all times.
It just does feel like the world is far more dangerous than it ever used to be.
It is. It is. On unintended consequences is where I would go.
Did you find it was a struggle to get Gen Z to fight or to join the military?
So I was kind of on the beginning of that when I was secretary, and it was very interesting because we still had we were making all our recruiting numbers. And then I remember seeing some of the advertisements because I was just intrigued with how we were marketing the message. I was a product of the volunteer service, which I changed the name. It's not a volunteered service anymore. It's an all recruited service. We're out there competing with Walmart, McDonald's, you name it. We're competing against them. So you are fully recruiting. But the messages have started to change, which is fantastic. I watched my Marine Corps go from seeing great-looking Marines doing silent drill and raising flags to an animated version of some guy playing a Dungeons and Dragons game and then picks up the Marine Corps sword and becomes an officer and fights freedom, fights for democracy. And I went, I have no association with that, but I guess that's selling into that market. And they said, yes, it is. So we're adapting is my story.
I also thought your AUKUS advertising was some of the best I've seen.
Yeah.
I mean, I kind of wish Australia had that sort of imagination, but it was kind of inspiring to see how you can make submarine production look sexy and interesting and noble, which of course it is.
It's very interesting. We have as an example, in Mobile, the industry, we're right along industry norms, Latika. We have a 20% turnover rate in our employees. And I kind of went, wow, that's unsustainable. Then we started peeling the numbers back. And we have about a 20% loss rate in year 1 and 2. Year 3, it drops to about 16%. Year 4, it drops to 9%. And then almost flatten lines
So
out.
once they're in,
So
they're in.
once we can get them over the hump, it's a very different work environment that some people saw it on television and said, I want to build ships for the United States Navy, and then realized in 90-degree heat in Mobile in August, this is a little tough, and they walk out the door. Those that stay, though, it's amazing. We can get them on the path to keep going forward.
I remember touring a BAE frigate prototype and being told about how they had to resize the beds because they couldn't get teens in. They had to offer Wi-Fi because streaming Netflix has become extremely important when you're out. I just thought, yeah, this sounds like a modern generation. And I don't think they sound like unreasonable expectations when you're on the job.
If you took someone like myself who went to the Marine Corps, which was very austere when I went through, and you're kind of saying, you want what? And, I remember at an all-hands meeting in Iwakuni, which the Japanese had just done a terrific job with infrastructure there. It was like going to a Hyatt hotel. And one of the complaints was from a Lance Corporal was they hadn't put the wall-to-wall carpeting in his bunk area yet. And I kind of went, you're talking to the wrong guy.
Richard Sensei, we're almost out of time, but I wonder, could you just describe for me when you were Secretary of Navy, what did a kind of average day in your life look like?
Latika, it's fascinating. So I worked on Wall Street for 19 years, which was no small task. They took their pound of flesh out of you, time consumption, resource consumption. You were there, you wanted to do it, you knew what you were doing. Then went through 2 startups, bought a company and then a startup. Thought I'd worked the hardest I'd worked in Intercontinental Exchange, which we brought up to a very meaningful company. And then I took this job, and by a factor of 3, this was the hardest job and the hardest I've ever worked. It was the most rewarding job I've had too. And the span of what you saw, this actually happened in one day. We started out the morning, 8 a.m., and you were the VIP of the parade for a graduating class down at Paris Island of brand newly minted Marines. And I literally, being a Marine, your heart just was out there with pride as these new Marines were marching by you. But the most fascinating thing, they all broke rank when they were dismissed to go see their parents. And some parents could not find their kids because they could not recognize their children. The change was absolutely stunning. And then we got on a plane, and at 4:00 in the afternoon, we were in Dover, Delaware for the dignified transfer of remains. And you were looking at parents in their eyes saying, on behalf of the United States of America, we're here to give condolences for your loss. That's a hell of a day.
God, the range of emotions in that single period. Wow, that's very moving. Were you at Donald Trump's military parade?
I was not.
Were you sad to have missed it?
I was in transit over here. I loved the UK.
Me too. One of my listeners works at DoD and asked me to ask you this question. What advice would you have for working in the Trump administration?
At what level?
I won't reveal.
No, I mean, I need a level. There's, if you're a secretary head, it's very different than if you're an SES or a GS or.
Let's say I think they're very much on board with all the things, but it is a very difficult time to keep your head down, isn't it?
It is.
And try and do your work well.
I have a compassionate outreach for anyone who's in the building right now doing their job and has that as a career. I do believe, in the case of John Phelan, he's a businessman. I know John. He's very commercial. He's going to address the commerciality of the United States Navy and the needs, which at the end of the day, Title 10, what does the Secretary do? Man, equip, buy, train, and provide those resources to the Secretary of Defense. So you're basically running a business. He will get his arms around that, and I think you're going to see some good improvements. The politics are static. I mean, that's tough, and you have to deal with that. And for those that are in there doing the job which needs to be done, I say thank you. Thank you. And if they're in there as a career person, just remember this too shall pass.
Do you think that Donald Trump is trashing America or making America great?
It's not an easy question to answer, and here's why. I actually do applaud some of his fundamental policies. It's just the delivery and the messaging and the attitude that just confounds me. I mean, did government need a review? It did, and there's been thousands of them on staffing and waste. Did Doge take a chisel or better yet, a 5-pound sledgehammer to a cranial operation? Yes, they did. But I was almost to the point going, this is what we need. Now, the unintended consequences, don't get me wrong, were far reaching, but we have to do something to rationalize how the organization works. That's an example of, okay, we had to do something. It was a massive shock to the system. Will there be betterment? We'll wait and see. I'm not a believer that you just cut off USAID, but I'm a believer, as an example, the Small Business Administration pre-COVID had 6,000 people. Post-COVID, it had 12,500. There are examples of that needed to be addressed. And by the way, we should be addressing this every 3 years. And oh, by the way, this is Congress's job that Doge was doing. Other efforts of the president, I get it. Make America great again, but can we just have delivery that is civil and deliver the message and move people along through leadership, not through bullyship?
On that note, Richard Spencer, I'd like to thank you so much for joining the podcast.
Certainly. Thank you, Latika.
You've been listening to Latika Takes with me, Latika Burke. You can find my work at latikambirk.com and this podcast where you find all your podcasts. See you next time.